Good afternoon. Welcome to the premises of Stefan Batory Foundation. It's a very great opportunity for us to meet so many eminent experts on the issue of populism and Eurosceptic discourses and so on. Our topic is today to talk about Europe without the Union and Eurosceptic and illiberal narratives in European and European social and political life. We have experts from many places, from North Macedonia, Slovenia, Italy, Poland. So we expect a really very interesting debate. I am very pleased that we were given the offer to organize this or co-organize this conference by the College of Eastern Europe, and we also had support from the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. So we are doing this event together, but the real host of the event is the college, and Laurinas Vaičiūnas, who is with us, and he is head of the college, will introduce us into the scope of this conference in a minute. But before I'll give him the microphone, let me share the last opening remarks. So we are supported in reaching our audience who is not with us here but is watching us in the internet by many media outlets, among them Polityka Weekly, Okopress, Euroactiv, Portal Spraw Zagranicznych, and Videocode. So we expect a broad audience. And also we are supported by translators who are translating this conversation from English into Polish, by Mr. Maciej Zgondek and Miss Marta Brudny. So saying this, I'd like to pass the microphone to Laurinas, and Laurinas, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone who's made it to Warsaw. Thank you very much to all the experts and our project partners who have managed to come to Warsaw and join us for this live event. Hello to our audience online. The discussion will be available in 2 languages, which is a great thing, so that as many of you can join and listen in. First of all, I have to thank the Batory Foundation and Edward Bending and his team for welcoming us here in Warsaw. We are a sort of very fairly spread out institution with colleagues in Wrocław, Warsaw, and Krakow. We don't have a place, a home in Warsaw, and so thank you very much for welcoming us here. And I would also like to thank Piotr Buras from the European Council on Foreign Relations here, the Warsaw office, for contributing and helping us and taking part in this discussion. So thank you very much to everyone for having us here. And the project itself, I think there'll be no one else, no one better than Dimitar Nikolovsky from the Youth Foundation think tank in Macedonia, the project leader, to present the project in more detail. But I think for us today is an occasion to present the work that we've been doing over the past half year in different countries across Europe, meaning in Slovenia, Italy, North Macedonia, Poland, looking at the illiberal and Eurosceptic narratives in the different countries, and doing the focus groups, meeting people, doing the research on the ground, and talking with people. So we're at an early stage, let's say, sort of maybe more or less halfway through the project, discovering and exploring the narratives and seeing how they pan out in different countries, both within the European Union and also on the, let's call it, on the threshold of Eastern Europe in the case of North Macedonia. So we have a fairly good array of countries being covered in this project. I'm very happy that we've been invited to it by our Macedonian partners. So I think I should not be taking too much time. I think the experts who have joined us here today have so many good, interesting things to say, and I think we can smoothly go into a discussion and explore the topic in more details and share our reflections. So thank you very much for those coming here, and then thank you very much for those who've joined us online. And let's have an interesting talk, and I'll probably pass it on to Dimitar as soon as possible.
Okay, just a second. Dimitar, okay, sorry, because my name is Adam Balcer. Let me introduce myself, and I'm going to moderate our panel. That's really a great pleasure and honor for me. And I'm program director at the College of Eastern Europe, and we are starting with the first panel, which is dedicated to our research, social reception of illiberal and Eurosceptic narratives. And we are going to talk about similarities, differences, and first of all, let me introduce our distinguished speakers, and then of course I will go the floor to Dimitar. So let's start with our ladies, and first of all Manuela Caiani, who is associate professor at Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy, based in Pisa and Firenze. Then we have Maria Wincławska, who is associate professor at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun in Poland. Next we have Kristina Angelewska, who is from Eurothink in North Macedonia, and we, last but not least, Faris Kocan, lecturer at University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And now I would like to give a floor to Dimitar Nikolowski, our director of Eurothink and our project leader, and he will present shortly our project, and then he will talk a little bit about similarities that we found in our research, focus groups, and interviews conducted with opinion makers. And then we will move to our countries, and case by case we will look at some kind of specificities of our research. So please, Dimitar, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the introduction, and I would like to thank all of the hosts who are welcoming us here today. So, yeah, I will just briefly present the project itself. As was mentioned before, first of all, there are 4 project partners. Eurothink Center for European Strategies is the coordinator of the project from North Macedonia. Then we have Scuola Normale Superiore from Italy, University of Ljubljana from Slovenia, and the College of Eastern Europe from Poland. The project started in March 2021 and will last until August 2022. And as the title of the project itself says, the aim is to tackle illiberal and Eurosceptic narratives in the EU and outside of the EU. And I put here 2 asterisks around the word tackling, because we were kind of careful when choosing this word, because we knew that our target, our aim was also to talk to people who are illiberals and who are leading these Eurosceptic narratives, but also the aim was to develop counter narratives to these narratives. So when we the word tackle can mean also to go against it and also to treat it in a way. So it was strategically used when contacting people for interviews and for focus groups. So the main activities are a balanced combination between the research and the on-site activities in order to maximize the impact. As part of this Europe for Citizens project, they mostly concentrate on dissemination events. And this is the purpose, with this purpose we are organizing 2 events in each of the countries and a final event, so 3rd event in North Macedonia. And this is the final event of the first part of the project. So we already had a conference in Štip in North Macedonia, then in Ljubljana, and then in Firenze. So today we are here in Warsaw. And at this first 4 events, we basically were presenting the findings of the research. And after this, next month, we are meeting in Tetovo in North Macedonia, where we will have a workshop with young people to develop with them some counter narratives to what we will be presenting. So ultimately, there should be a dialogue among the civil society, academia, and the media on these topics. So the research at the national level we started with desktop analysis, looking at surveys, looking at media reports, platforms of political parties and organizations. And then we did interviews with political activists, with experts, with also people from political parties and from civil society. And then we conducted focus groups in each of the countries to speak to citizens, some of whom are supporters of illiberal Eurosceptic narratives or are on the other side. And the products of the research should be 4 national policy briefs with policy recommendations and 1 comparative study in the end among the 4 countries. And the final outcome should be to develop a sort of international network, both actually at the national level and international level, to develop these networks with the knowledge on how to counter these illiberal and Eurosceptic narratives. Now, I'm using here some definitions that were mostly used by my colleagues in previous presentations. So first about the definition from Taggart on Euroscepticism: contingent or qualified opposition, as well as incorporating outright and unqualified opposition to the process of European integration. And this is, he's making this distinction between soft Eurosceptics, who are not basically in direct opposition to European integration, and hard Eurosceptics who are absolutely not in favor of integration. And then illiberal democracy, this was a definition used by, I think, by our colleagues from Slovenia. A system where free elections still exist and there is no explicit violent oppression of citizens. State apparatus rejects criticism by citizens and hinders participation in political process. So basically, a move against free civil society, so to say. And some of the associations that are used: populism first, which I didn't write here, then conservatism, nationalism, far right, radicalism. Some of the colleagues were also contacting and treating the far left. And for example, for the case of North Macedonia, it was important to put it also in the brackets of preventing and countering violent extremism, considering the experience that we had in 2017 and the storming of the parliament. And just a few general narratives that we have come across. First, that there are differences between the inside and the outside of the EU. As we all know, we have represented here 3 member states and 1 candidate, which is North Macedonia. So there are first-hand experiences with the functioning of the EU, and then certain criticisms as to how the EU is functioning or how promises are being made. And then I would say reasons why people from outside of the EU and people who are citizens of candidates for member states would be moving against the idea of European integration. And as we can see in the Western Balkans, there are a lot of, let's say, promises of the predictability of the process that are not taking place, or also notions of unequal treatment among countries. So from the Western Balkans, the most advanced country in terms of European integration is Serbia, that has very serious flaws in the way of functioning of their democratic institutions. And then there are certain differences between the old member states. Here we have at least Italy as representatives, and the newer ones. And these are certain frustrations that are arising from the promises of equal development, and then failure for proper economic integration, that there are still stark differences in terms of the economy between the two. This is one, the economic argument, and the second one is the cultural one, that usually in the narratives on the EU, it is considered this Western European culture, which is in some conflict, as we are very well here in Poland, with the traditionalist values of societies here. And of course, the Euro crisis from 2008 and then the migration crisis have also caused the rise of Eurosceptic narratives, because we see that there are some faults in the way of functioning. And we were also looking at the transnational ties and the strife of these local actors to connect internationally and at the European level, which I would say it's still an ongoing process with small success, but not that much. And I would stop here, and I will let my colleagues continue with the case studies.
Dimitar, thank you very much for your excellent introduction. And right now, maybe we will move smoothly to Macedonia, and I will ask Christina to present the Macedonian case, please.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the hosts for hosting us today, and good afternoon to our audience online. As Dimitar elaborated a little bit more about the project, in last spring, particularly in May 2021, a set of focus groups were conducted, research field analysis. And this focus group report is consisted of several cities, and these cities were purposely selected in the country. Like, for instance, Štip and Veles are places in North Macedonia, cities where mostly, in terms of nationality and ethnicity, Macedonians predominate, and a lot of people may encounter particularly the right-oriented perspectives and Euroscepticism in these cities in particular, whereas Struga and Tetovo are located in the western part of the country, and it's a mix of different ethnicities and identities, mostly Macedonians, Albanians, and other ethnicities and nationalities. And Skopje was also selected as a place to conduct the focus groups because it's the capital of the country, and it's a mix of everything, and a lot of occurrences do take place in the capital. There were there was a set of guiding questions used during this focus groups. The first one, what does Europe and the European Union mean to you? That was one of the questions asked to the participants. And then the next one, what are the advantages that they might see of a potential membership to the EU, and the disadvantages as well. And they were also asked, what would they change about Europe and the European Union? Also, as a result of the research field analysis, several master frames were developed. The first one was consisted of Europe versus the EU equals to the EU. So to most of the participants, Europe means the European Union. So they do not quite make the distinction between two of them, and it's all about the advantages of the membership. And then free market is also one of the advantages of Europe and the European Union in particular. Civilization, because they had a different perception of what does civilization mean in the Western Balkans versus civilization in the European Union and Europe in general, and something to strive for. The culture, also the perceptions of the culture, European culture versus culture in North Macedonia and the Western Balkans is also quite different to people. The diversity, a key perception here is that united Europe actually means diversity. The end of the nationalisms, it's also another striking result of this research. Carbon-free, green Europe, that's how they perceive it as well. And I'd share a quote here from two participants. The first participant from a focus group in Veles. They said, no real conflict between being Macedonian and being European. That's how they perceive it. And the next participant shared that we're technically European, but still not quite European. And then the second master frame, it's about the EU, the European Union. They're positive, but still hypocritical. They do have hurt feelings from the Prespa agreement and the official name change. The discourse on the European Union that is still dominated by Bulgaria issue, it's still also very predominant, and it's a myriad of broken promises. A participant from a focus group in Tetovo shared that we're still stuck in the waiting room. And then another participant from Štip, they say they propagate European values, but then deny our right to self-determination and tolerate Bulgaria's absurd demands. This is another narrative. And another participant from a focus group in Štip, they said we're too obedient to others and we need to start thinking for ourselves. Another master framework that was developed, it's about the negative aspects of the European Union. And these negative aspects are mostly consisted of very dominated by the cultural issues, like, for instance, the LGBTQIA+ community, cannabis legalization, and other drugs. Very discriminatory against those who are not part of it, like candidates for membership, migrants, and the lack of COVID solidarity. And this is a slogan that was developed last spring, thank you, Serbia, because in a time when North Macedonia was lacking vaccines, the government of Serbia enabled citizens of North Macedonia to get vaccinated in Serbia for free. I'll share two more quotes from two participants. The first one is from a focus group in Štip. They say youth is already Europeanized here, but Europeanized for them means they follow all the negative trends from the European Union. And then another participant from Tetovo, they said the EU gives too much rights to bicycle riders. We, the car drivers, are discriminated against, which in itself is also a rather specific narrative, I would say. Another master framework that was developed, it's about the visions of Europe and Europe's future. To people, there are no clear visions of what Europe should look like in the future. And it should become more open and to stand in Macedonia's defense. Very limited popularity of liberal international actors, such as Eurasian Union, and is generally open to other alternatives. Like, for instance, a participant from in Tetovo said, we're anyways stuck in the waiting room, and we should look for closer cooperation with the United States. And then this comes from a participant in Štip. I have no hope we will be accepted as full members. We should seek an associative status like Switzerland or Norway. And then a participant from Skopje says that full membership is an illusion for our country, but we should at least get into the common market, so to be considered as an advantage to be part of the common market. I'd focus just on the focus group reports. And then, as a result of this research analysis with citizens in our country from several focus groups, preliminary conclusions and recommendations were developed. The first conclusion is that Bulgaria issue poses a challenge to the support of EU among Macedonian citizens, and alternatives are sought. Eurosceptic alternatives are still very marginal in North Macedonia, and these three key recommendations are: the first one, continuous education on European Union and European values is still very much needed. A need for a breakdown of the benefits of EU membership beyond the usual mantras, because they seem to be lost or forgotten. And the third one is that common regional market needs fast implementation. So that's on my behalf. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christina, really, for being short and snappy. And now, please, Faris, the floor is yours. The Slovenian case.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Adam, for the words. A good afternoon to everyone. Let me just continue where the North Macedonian case ended, due to the fact that Christina has already said a lot about the frames, the questions on which how we tackled the focus groups. Let's just continue with the Slovenian one. So Marko and I, we have prepared a focus group or conducted focus two focus groups. So the first one in...
Presentation is here, just somewhere.
Okay. Okay. So we prepared two focus groups, one in the western part of Slovenia with the far left voters, or maybe part of those far left organizations or political parties, and then in the East Slovenia we've done the same with the far right supporters or members. So in regardings to the findings of the focus groups, we try to be rather concrete with around 4 elements on which we want to reflect on the master frames. So in terms of the overall attitude, we could saw that the radical right voters were disappointed. They said that they expected more. There are no jobs, and those jobs that are available are relatively poorly paid. In short, what the European Union as such promised did not happen. When it comes to the radical left, they were more sovereign, or were more authoritative here, so they said we expected it, right? So the European Union as such is a liberal economic project and an ideological tool pursuing the interest of the capital, not the people. So they were not disappointed, they were like more Euro-realistic, so we know what happens when you come into such group of people. In terms of concretization, you could see that the radical right was taking back control, so the Brussels is governed or dictated by bureaucrats that don't have touch with the field, that don't know the real problems, right? They decide what we should eat and drink, they prescribe certain regulations on how cucumbers are, how bananas are, you know, things like that, so multiculti globalists. Abandoning the national democracies and such, right? So, and regarding the radical left, we could observe this narrative of liberal empty shell. So the European Union is this empty shell, right? Brussels is becoming just an institution where you can pursue or apply for co-funding of the projects and nothing more. When it comes to ideology, so here we try to segregate it within this inside-out or outside-in paradigm, right? So in terms of the radical right, the positive thing is that Slovenia got rid of Yugoslavia, but we did not get rid of socialism. So that was like the master frame within those focus groups. So in terms of the radical left, you could saw this Western bourgeoisie and their local assistants, again, this liberal, neoliberal narrative, right, in terms of the ideology. And finally, here we should mention the transnational linkages. So in terms of this radical rights, it's more or less non-EU style. Of course, transnational linkages are okay, but between sovereign states. And in the radical left group, we could see this functional or pragmatic transnationalism. So there are some policy areas where we should work together, right? Environmental policy, for example, they said, but not with Verhofstadtian, so types of politicians. Again, this neoliberal or liberal critique, right? And maybe to wrap up, also to reflect a bit on the expert interviews, what Dimitar was also talking, and Christina in part. So here you can see that in terms of the identity narratives, we couldn't see this exclusivist logic. So being European doesn't mean that you cannot be Slovenian. So all of the interviewees said that it's okay, we are European and we are Slovenian. So it's not this toxic relationship as it can be in other states. But of course the European Union narrative is again an empty shell, empty signifier. The European Union as such doesn't mean anything to them, right? So political cleavages, of course, you could expect repositioning of the central right and central left policies. Of course, again, in the center is this neoliberal ideology. Because of that, the center left is trying to defend the liberal values, and of course, the center right is coming into these identitarian topics. And the transnational linkages So you could see here that most of our interviewees, they didn't talk about maybe connections with the political elites. So for example, Janša, Orban or Morawiecki, Janša, they were mostly talking about the European political groups, and they didn't problematize that. So that's also an important maybe message from the interviews. And with that, I will give back the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Faris, very much. And right now, Maria, please.
Okay, I can see it. Okay, thank you very much. I am going to present a bit of our research. We concentrated, of course, on Poland, and these are going to be the, well, short report on what we found or how we can tell the story from the focus groups. And I would start with the notion that to understand the thinking and reasoning of the Eurosceptics, we must learn, understand and analyze the narratives about the EU. And this was really my task in the project, to learn about the narratives of the Eurosceptics that they hold in Poland. And we try to do it by organizing focus group. We did organize 3 focus groups in different cities in Poland, and we had 22 participants who took part in this focus group. What is more to our story is that what we can find in their arguments, it resonates very well with the narratives of the Polish government and of what is published in the government-owned media. But we are still working on this project. So here in my presentation, this media part is only going to be like an illustrative part to what we learned from the focus group. So in order to analyze the Eurosceptic narratives, I used 4 frames of analysis that was the frames were introduced by 2 scholars, by Andrea Piro and Stijn van Kassel in their 2018 article on populist parties, narrations into countries in Italy and in the Netherlands. And they used the frames to see how the frames reverberate in respective party systems. And I did a reverse thing, really, in the discussion on the European Union. And I looked for these 4 frames, asking which of them and in what context they may be found in the views of the Polish Eurosceptic. And then in the next step in the project that I was already talking about, that I already mentioned, is that we are going to ask the questions how these views resonate in the narratives offered by the Eurosceptic parties in Poland, and how do they use it to shape the European, or rather I should say anti-European discourse. And as I said in my presentation, I will use it only as an illustrative material to illustrate every one of these 4 frames that I am going to discuss. The citations here that you have on the side, I am not going to read it. These are the citations of the respondents on the topics in the frames that I put here. So the first frame that can be found in this in our research is the sovereignty frame, and as you see here, it's also present in the media. One of the banners of the Polish main news program in defense of Polish dignity and sovereignty. And what the respondents were talking about when they were talking about Polish sovereignty and about the European Union. And the European Union was accused of taking the sovereignty of the states by interfering with matters that should be reserved for the states. And among these matters, of course, there were the liberal values of the European Union, or on which the European Union is built, but also the current affairs were tackled many times, like the arguments with the EU that interferes with the Polish judicial system, and the climate policy was also tackled in this aspect. It also, I mean, the European Union also possesses a threat of limiting the sovereignty further by acquiring new prerogatives and competences, and it does so, according to our respondents, in an unlawful way, for example, by the EU tribunal's verdicts not on the treaty. So the European Union, according to our respondents, Europeans want to create a super state, and of course the super state will limit the sovereignty of the nation states, and this was something that we as Poland didn't agree in 2004 when joining the European Union. The promise was different. The second frame that can be distinguished is legitimacy frame. And it is not so obvious as the first one in the respondents' arguments. The arguments that we can find here are going like in two ways. The first one is the imbalance of the states that are the members of the European Union, that there is the clear division between the old states and the new states. And of course the old states, on top of which we have Germany and France, and they are running the European Union to their own benefit. And if their other countries are not subordinate, and of course especially if the countries of the new new countries of the European Union are not subordinate to the main countries, they are punished in different ways. And another dimension of this legitimacy discourse was the detachment of the European elites who run ambiguous interests, who are corrupt, and they are of course very far from the people. People, so it's something that you can also see in populist discourse on the European Union, but also on in the discourse in nation countries, in nation states, on governments and on elites. Then the third frame that we distinguished, it was the cultural frame, and it was a big issue as it is in other countries. And here again, it can be defined in two dimensions. The first dimension is the need of protection of national identity and national traditions against the European Union, because the European Union would like to unify all the traditions, all the values and everything that can be unified really in the Western world. And when we were talking about these values, I also asked the respondents, well, is it only the European things? Can you blame only the European Union? And they say, well, no, not really. We can blame the Western values in general, but also, of course, the European Union tries to impose these values on us. And then the second dimension of this cultural flame is accusation of the European Union of taking away Polish identity, Polish values by imposing liberal values and norms, and not allowing Poland and of course the other member states to stick to their values. And according to the respondents, of course, the Polish values are driven out from the Catholic Church values. So of course the respondents didn't want to or didn't see, for example, the LGBTQ community. They didn't want to let this community to acquire their rights. For example, they said that the marriage can be only between men and women. They don't have anything against the gay couples, but of course we cannot call it marriage. And the second dimension in this discourse was also against immigrants, especially understood by Muslim immigrants. And then the last frame that I would like to tackle here is the socio-economic frame, and this was the only frame that really wasn't, if we can say it, against the European Union. This was something that our respondents saw the European Union as beneficial to Poland, and they found many arguments saying that not only Poland benefited economically from joining the European Union, but also they themselves benefited quite a lot from being in the European Union. However, and this is, I think, one of the most important things here, they say, well, we should stay in the European Union for as long as we benefit economically. For as long as we get more money from the European Union, then we pay to the European budget. If we were to pay to the European budget more money, we should withdraw immediately from this community, because it's only an economical organization. So since if we don't benefit, we shouldn't be there. We also tackled the question of euro, and here all the respondents agreed that Poland should definitely stay out of the eurozone, mostly because of the prices that will will rise if we join the European Union. So if we would like to give some conclusions here, we could say that, of course, we were interviewing the Eurosceptics, so they had a rather negative image of the European Union, and the negative image was mostly in these three frames as cultural sovereignty and legitimacy, and the socio-economic frame that we distinguished was the only one that was in a way favorable towards the European Union. And here are the pictures, the drawings of the respondents that I was asked to include in this presentation. I used the projective techniques, and I asked my respondents to imagine that a European Union is a vehicle, and ask them, well, how would European Union look like as a vehicle? And as you can see here, most of the drawings show that that there are many structural flaws of the European Union, that it's a malfunctioning organization. As you can see in this picture with this pink car, the question is, where is the driver? So it means that the European Union is an organization that doesn't know where to go, to be honest. Then they also said the European Union is a divided organization. The division is between the rich Western countries and the poorer Eastern countries. You can see the top drawing there, that the car is divided, and the really nice one at the, in front, and then the old countries, old car in the back that represents the new member state. And maybe one more picture that I would like to draw your attention to is the one with the two cars. So again, you can see the division in between old and new Europe. The old one has its own values. You can see the rainbow flag that it's there, and the sign of Euro, and you can see that it takes the car that is behind into the abyss. So the new countries that we try to stop the European Union from the disaster, but probably we won't manage to do it. And I would finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Sorry if I maybe abused my power a little bit and I give a little bit more time to Maria, but we are in Poland, and that's why I'm sorry that I'm a little bit biased, but nevertheless, it was really an excellent presentation. And right now, Manuela, yes. Italy.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much for this excellent organization, for being here. I will try to be synthetic, although this is not my main characteristic. As in the other countries, we also try to grasp empirically the narratives, Eurosceptical or Eurocritical narratives from below. And we did several focus groups that you can see here. Basically, we tried to cover in our three focus groups the main Italian subcultures, let's say the left-wing one, that usually is a subculture pro-European Union, or basically which have been, yes, supporting also the beginning of the European project, including Italy, the eastern and northern part of Europe, which is the headquarters, let's say, of Northern League and its constituency, and which would have been most likely the main focus, the main origin of Eurosceptical claims and frames on Europe. And then we also wanted to cover the Rome region, which is a region where many neo-Nazi extreme right groups from civil society live and let's say socialize people. Together with focus groups, we also did many interviews. Now, if here I have the numbers. The focus groups, as I said, were 3, not necessary to enter into details, and then we did 9 in-depth interviews with representatives of pro and anti-European civil society, Italian civil society organizations. Mainly they were social movements, again, on the right and on the left. And to synthesize the focus groups content, let me also add that, as has been done in other countries, especially Poland, we used many images in order basically to replicate the questions that also other groups used to conduct focus groups, like what does Europe mean to you, what is good or bad for Europe, and what changes do you have in mind when you think about Europe and improvement. But basically, we wanted to use images to tackle these questions. And what we had at the end, the main findings from interviews, but also from the focus groups. From the interviews, we saw that we could find three main criticisms targeting Europe. So Europe is criticized within, I would say, a soft Euroscepticism approach. So very rarely we find in Italy a hard Euroscepticism, as Dimitar showed as an analytical category. But within this soft Euroscepticism, meaning that Italian people still accept Europe as a polity frame of reference, but they do criticize a lot Europe. So within this soft Euroscepticism, which doesn't deny Europe and the membership, we found three main frames, three main types of Europe which is criticized, a cultural one, and this criticism come mainly from the right-wing civil society groups, and this criticism find a parallel or let me say, discursive opportunity structure in the cultural criticism toward Europe, which is mainly mobilized at the party level by the Northern League. And so according to this criticism, Europe is criticized because it brings about too much uniformity, and therefore it damages the cultural country traditions and many other local specificities, also in terms of economic. Think about the fact that mainly European criticism come from, as I said, northeastern part of Italy, which is also characterized by a very typical network of middle, small-sized enterprises. The other frame we found very often mobilized is an economic frame, which criticizes Europe because of the unequal treatment among member states, and also the excessive intervention by the European institutions, as for instance the European Bank, over the Italian economy. And then finally we also found a third frame, very often mobilized, which we called political criticism, which is not so far from what other countries found in terms of legitimacy, sovereignty. According to this criticism, which come, I have to say, mainly from left-wing association talking about Europe. According to this criticism, Europe is strongly criticized because of the democratic deficit of the EU, and therefore there is the call. In this case, is a call for more Europe. Therefore, a more direct channel between citizens and European institutions and decision making. The focus groups mainly replicated, or better confirmed, what we found in the interviews. What we found here, very briefly, was a diffuse criticism among ordinary citizens. Extreme right-wing exponents, very similarly, are those who more strongly and sharply criticize European Union. So here we also can find some signals of rejectionism, and we cannot really define it as a sort of breeding ground for a Brexit, Italian exit campaign. And then we also found some groups dynamics during these focus groups. especially in those focus groups mainly populated by left-wing representatives and civil society associations. Here, groups dynamics that tended to divide the debate on Europe in the political cleavage between left and right. And then finally, as I said, for the interviews, we found that mainly the left-wing approach was a sort of reformist approach toward Europe and toward the criticism on Europe. So our approach that accepts and emphasizes the European Union as a good thing, a good project to bet on again, but still in need to reform under several respects. I would stop here. Just let me conclude with two considerations that have been are growing now in these in this last month that we are also concluding our report. The first consideration is that if we think about frames and frames on Europe, we can more or less what I see in Italy, but also in the other countries, we can divide between two types of frames of Euro criticism or Euro support. The instrumental ones, so Europe is good or bad for something instrumental, economic, from some concrete advantages. But also there are very spread, I would say, also what we can call norms and values and cultural frames. So Europe is good or bad for something relating to values. No? It can be peace, it can be inclusion, solidarity. So something which is not a direct output, like economic, instrumental. And this, in my view, I am a politologist, so it is not, it can go in parallel to what Sharpe, the politologist Sharpe, said about the input or output legitimacy of any political institution. And Europe, for its institutional setting, has been always mainly interpreted by to work in terms of output legitimacy. So Europe, for its opaque and, let me say, complex institutional arrangement, according to which the European Parliament doesn't matter a lot, so has been always seen as an institution which can you know, emphasize its legitimacy in terms of outputs. But at the same time, in the last 10 years, and also increasingly today under the COVID stress, the output legitimacy is increasingly difficult to be found. And so I would say, at least for Italy, but probably one of the main recommendations that come up in my mind, that it's probably that we have to insist on the cultural and value frames concerning Europe. So the outputs are not just concrete outputs and therefore linkable to the instrumental economic side, but the output and therefore outputs legitimacy can also be seen in terms of values and norms, frames that probably need to be, as you said, nurtured a bit more among the population, especially the young. So Europe is good for peace, green, inclusion, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Grazie mille. Sorry for pressing you, Manuela, but in fact we are slightly delayed, and right now I would like to give a floor to Piotrek Buras, who is head of the CFR office in Warsaw, and really I appreciate him as one of the best experts in the European Union regarding the Euroscepticism, things like that. And of course it's a mission impossible right now for him to comment and to gather all this information that he received from you. But probably we provided you, Piotrek, with some food for thought, and you have also your own ideas and your own assessment, evaluation of the current state of play in the EU, and especially social mood and opinion polls and so on. So please share with us what you learned from us, maybe something new or something is obvious. Of course, we wanted to show, that's my impression, that we wanted to show differences, but still, even in our country cases, there are still many similarities. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for inviting me to join this very interesting discussion. And I think it is indeed a mission impossible to comment on four such various presentations. And also, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to deal with the details of your presentation, as you all used to some extent different methodologies, or it is slightly different approaches. So it's, and I also to our viewers, I've just followed. I just you know, reacting spontaneously on what I have followed over the last hour, and I think what I could contribute to this to the discussion is a view from someone who's not actually expert on public opinion or social research, but rather someone who's following the development of the European Union itself. And so what I'm very much interested in is the question where all that actually comes from. Because you have outlined a very interesting picture, which is, I think, quite, as Adam alluded to, quite common for all those countries, of a number of, and I think Maria had this very useful categorization of these. I don't remember how you call that, but the triggers or the spheres or frames. Sovereignty, legitimacy, culture, and socio-economic aspects, as those areas where basically the Eurosceptics draw their arguments from. And indeed, I think it's as we have seen, it's a case of all those countries that basically it's very similar in a way. Of course, with some differences, but still it's quite similar. And what is also a very obvious similarity is also that I think my impression at least was maybe it is the research is kind of biased in that regard, that a certain strength of these narratives. I mean, of course, you were looking for those narratives, so it's not so perhaps surprising that you have come across them and that you highlight them. But still, I think it is also for someone who's not following social research or not doing social research quite obvious that there is a rising wave of anti-European Eurosceptic arguments. And what I would like to do in a few minutes is to reflect upon why I think this is the case and what are the deeper sources of that. But before I do that, one general observation and actually a surprise, which I would like to share with you after having followed your research, and this is the fact how little role or a negligible role in all those anti-European narratives seems to play the climate change, especially climate policy of the European Union. And this is, I think, this is for me, at least in Poland, but not only in our country, but also beyond Poland. We here at the Battery Foundation, we have done some research and writing on that, and Edwin Bendig contributed to a very interesting project run by Counterpoint in London, analyzing the green wedge. Green wedge as being basically the problems of how to fight climate change being one of the drivers of socio-political divisions in our societies, and also driving very much the anti-European agenda. And in your findings, actually, it hasn't played any significant role. This is at least my impression. And that was, for me, and this is just a question mark, why is it so, and how to explain that? Because I think that this is, it has been kind of proven already that this is, that it is part of the Eurosceptic narrative, and also my hunch that it will play an incredibly devastating role for the image of the European Union and will feed into this anti-European sentiments. But then, just really very briefly, 3 points why I think all that is happening. basically? Where is it? Where it comes from? And I think it may vary across Europe, but I think there are three very general reasons why the Euroscepticism is flourishing. And the first one is what you said about the input legitimacy, and so basically the phenomenon of European crisis over the last decade. So this image of the European Union as a guarantor of prosperity and continuous kind of progress towards a better future has kind of collapsed. And of course, not only because of the crisis the European Union has suffered over the last years, but also because I think the whole Europe and the whole West has been in such a crisis. And it has been that we have, over the last decade or more, we have realized that this is probably inevitable, that our life standard would not necessarily improve in the future, and that a certain era has come to an end. And I think, and of course, and the European Union has always benefited, at least in Poland, in Central Eastern Europe, from this very massive belief that the future would be better. And I think since this belief has collapsed or is in crisis, the EU is also kind of hit by that. But this is not, of course, not the only, and even maybe not the more important source, I think. And the second one for me is the fact that, and this is also a very well-known phenomenon in the social research, that the nature of the main socio-economic, socio-political cleavage in our societies has changed. It used to be the socio-economic or economic cleavage. So this distinction between the right and left as defined in economic terms used to be the main driver of social or political divides. And now I think you have the Fukuyama book on the identity, you have the research by Ronald Inglehart and others, saying basically that the identity question has become much more dominant. And I think this is as long as we had this economic focus and the belief in a better economic future, and as long as we had the Washington consensus and belief that free market and liberalization, more openness would save us from various problems, so long we can, the European Union as a project basically advancing all that, benefited from the situation. Now, since identity issues have become much more kind of dominant, I think all those cultural opposition towards projects of globalization, integration, denationalization, and all that, have been fueled in a much more significant way than before. And the last point, I think, which needs to be taken into account, and also, and I think all that is kind of important, I think, for the question how to tackle Euroscepticism and illiberal thinking, because the last point, I think, relates to the development or the transformation of the European Union itself. And I think, especially as seen from Warsaw or from Poland, I think there is one extremely important trait of this transformation of the European Union, which is related to the fact that when we were joining the European Union, it was still, the European integration was still a process which was responding to the intra-European problems. The problem of peace, of cohesion, the problem of the need of bringing two parts of Europe together. And there is also an echo of that in all your presentations. Basically, some people saying, those who have a favorable view of the European Union, saying that it's something which brings people together, and others who are disappointed of the European Union saying this is, you know, there are two parts of Europe, and the EU is doing nothing about that, and so on. So there is an echo of this kind of vision of the European Union. And in the European integration was a force of convergence, of economic convergence, bringing things together in Europe, overcoming divisions. And I think that it has changed in a very profound way. Now the legitimacy of the European Union is basically derived more and more, and this is also the language of the institutions, of the European elites, from EU's response to the outside challenges. So basically the EU is needed not in order to preserve peace in Europe, but the EU is needed to respond to the China challenge. The EU is needed to respond effectively to the climate change. We need the EU because Europe is becoming weaker and weaker, and we cannot cope with all those problems on our own as nations and EU member states. And all those the narrative about the European Union from the past is no longer kind of up to the task and not corresponding to the current challenges. And I think in the last observation that's a very if this analysis is true, then the question is how to make sure that we can if this analysis of basically of the transformation of the nature of the European Union in response to all those problems, crisis, change of social political cleavages, role of the European Union in the world, if that's is correct view, then the question is of course how to formulate those pro-European narrative which would tackle this anti-European, Eurosceptic language, and which would be able to respond to all those criticisms which you have identified in your presentations related to these four main spheres, to these four frames. So I think that is so much from me, I think, for now. And the last perhaps suggestion is it would be very interesting to see if there is something like a policy transfer between Eurosceptics across Europe. So to what extent, for example, our successful Eurosceptics are a kind of a role model for I don't know, Slovenia or North Macedonia or others. So I think there is also this academic concept or methodology of policy transfer which could be useful to look at that. Okay, so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotrek, very much. The EU, in fact, in my humble opinion, was built on this principle win-win situation, so and mutual reciprocity, and we thank you very much for your contribution, because we also, I think, learned something from you, and it was really this eagle's eye view that was excellent, and I think you created a bridge that we can go smoothly. We can move smoothly to the second panel, which is going to be moderated by Edwin Bendyk, and I'm passing the floor and mic to Edwin, please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for all these splendid presentations and for this comment by Piotr. And we had some questions raised asked by Piotr, so we can refer to them in a discussion we will have just after the panel. So I propose to, because the topic of the panel is now looking the answer for, I would say, the second part of the problem, because we're talking about the societal dimension of the issue of Euroscepticism and illiberalism. Now we'll be talking about political forces who can use these, let's say, societal emotions, feelings in their political agendas. So our task is to, I would say, to sketch a map of these political forces and look forward how these forces can develop in the future. So, so we changed the panel, but we haven't changed the floor. So because still we have 3 of my panelists are the same as in the first part. So I mean Dimitar Nikolowski, Manuela Kajani, and Adam Balcer. And we are joined in this part by Marko Lovec, Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Social Science. Focus of his research is on the politics of European integration, institutional developments, and Central and Eastern Europe. So welcome to the panel. And just after this first round, when we try to sketch this map, we will open discussion to all other panelists, so we can talk about issues raised during the first panel and the second one. So beginning this panel, I'd like to refer to 3 points. First, and the first one is going back in time to the last European elections. So you remember this mood. So we were thinking in similar way as Piotr said, that this populist Eurosceptic wave is rising up, and that this dark or brown wave will come into the European Parliament. But something happened, and of course many of right-wing members of parliament came in, but in fact a green wave prevailed. So the question is, what happened? So how this, I would say, counter force to Eurosceptic force prevailed, and which kind or what kind of set of factors decide about this socio-economic one or socio-cultural one? I'm asking about this phrase we used in discussing how to mobilize public opinion to change the mind. So if we can have this problem or this moment in memory. The second issue, and the second point, is the last gathering of right-wing politicians in Madrid. Perhaps you remember this phenomenon. It was not the first one, because earlier, a couple of months earlier, we had the similar gathering in Warsaw, and earlier we had a declaration signed by many of them about the future of Europe. So the process is going on. And this last one was very interesting. So if you remember, we had there Mr. Morawiecki, the Prime Minister of Poland. We had Mr. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. We had Madame Le Pen, who is a presidential candidate in France. We had other more or less prominent politicians from Spain, from Romania, from Lithuania, and many other countries. However, we didn't have many from Italy. So we didn't have Matteo Salvini, for example. So it was interesting. So the question is, what is the real political force? Of course, we can say what it means in Poland or in Hungary, because it's really strong, but what they really mean in other countries. So it's just a political noise, or it's something stronger, not only in terms of their electoral support, but rather of their influence on a discourse. So how they can be effective in, let's say, moving the so-called Overton window and imposing Eurosceptic narratives into mainstream discourse. And that now is the third issue about the future. Aren't you afraid that sometime in the future, if this case of moving of Overton window would happen, we could have the situation when Euroscepticism would be used in liberal centrum, I would say, because of questions like the issues concerning the fight with climate change and this necessity of changing lifestyles, like consumption lifestyles, or this cost on changing of my freedom of choice. Yes, which are very, let's say, important for liberal mainstream. And all of a sudden it can happen that, or it must happen, to be honest, to achieve the green goals. It must happen, and our consumption choices must be compromised in the future. So, aren't you afraid that we have no problem with Euroscepticism of our days and right-wing or left-wing populist parties, but perhaps we can have bigger problems with liberal forces? In some way it happens in Europe, because even liberal forces are moving to the right, using this anti-migrants rhetorics and so on. So it happens. So this is the framework of our discussion, but of course perhaps you have your own angles to this problem, so feel free in sketching this map. It's important to have it as creative as is possible. And if I can begin with Manuela, with this question, why Matteo Salvini didn't come to Madrid.
He didn't tell me why, but what I can answer here, trying to make more my answer a bit more general than the single event in Madrid. The Europeanization of the far right, now in general, also the transnationalization of the radical right or right-wing or the populist radical right, has been is all still a bit controversial, no? Because as we know, the radical right in its core ideological values is one of the main components is nationalism, and most strongly ethno-nationalism, and therefore it is not by chance that several attempts in the history of the development of an European radical right group at the European Parliament or European Radical Right Party. There have been several attempts in the history, and always failing, you know, because these forces still felt as a contradiction. On the one hand, they realized the need to go supranational because the policy and the decision-making level was shifting there. But at the same time, their ideology is made, and therefore, as for Italy, I can clearly remember the event in which one of these attempt of European grouping was failed because of Alessandra Mussolini, so the leader of one of the most important at the time radical right party, at one point accused the other leader of the Romanian party of the radical right with typical xenophobic claims. No? So she reproduced so therefore so what I can answer is that in terms of Europeanization, transnationalization of the radical right, for instance, Giorgia Meloni, the other main important representative of the radical right in Italy, was present in another European gathering in Valencia, no? 1 year ago. And she was also very skillful in talking Spanish, so she was emphasizing a lot this idea of brotherhood, no? Together with the radical right in Spain. And so I don't know why in this case Salvini was not there, but what I can see for sure is that still for the radical right in Italy is a bit controversial, this move toward building transnational contact and the main vocation, which is nationalist, and therefore with all the, also because they find the contradictions at the political discourse level, they still insist on nationalism and xenophobic claims, and therefore how would you justify then, for instance, an European group with Romanian representatives, no? While in public TV you criticize waves of Romanian immigrants, no? So it is a contradiction they still have to resolve, at least in Italy. Thank you.
But if you could add something about other issues, like is it possible to imagine counter forces to this? You mentioned this about that in Italy, so it's not only about this pro-European thinking. It's not only about socio-economic issues, but also about cultural issues that we can feel good about, or think good about Europe in terms of peace, for example, perhaps in terms of green change and so on. So how do you see these forces as a tool against Euroscepticism and illiberalism?
Okay, No, thank you for this extra question. No, I found very interesting the point that you raised, about the absence of frames concerning Europe and climate, and concerning, I can add also other important absences that I realize actually, like Europe and gender equality, while at the same time we see and we know that in many fields, also at the national level, for instance in Italy, in academia, but also in many other fields, Europe is pushing a lot for gender equality in many policies. And however, it looks like the pro-European forces don't use these frames. No, and for frames, usually we mean cognitive schemes, no, within which you, or through which you construct the political and symbolic reality around you. So paradoxically, you are right. No, it looks like these counter right-wing populist forces, or better, pro-European forces are not using, or at least are not recognizing enough that Europe is there also for value characterized benefits, no? Like it can be climate change policy, can be gender equality, can be other issues. So I see these, there are many, in terms of numbers, there are many social movements in Italy pro-European, pro-Europe. There is, there is. I would say that the scenario in Italy is really divided 50-50 between anti-European or criticizing Europe and pro-European. But you are right in underlying that still the pro-European frames are not covering all the issues they could cover, let me say. In this sense, I stop here, I can mention there is a useful concept that we could use about that to interpret this situation. It is the concept of the meaning of silence. It is built by Medrano, who works a lot on frames. The meaning of silence means that when something is not quoted, it is not quoted, is not mentioned, it means that still it is not in the hand of the people. So in this case, I would say it is quite surprising that climate is not there, gender is not there, but it looks like, so that we have to reflect about the meaning of the silence on these issues and these frames, because probably it means that they still are not into the mentality and the conceptual maps of our pro-European forces. Thank you.
Really great remarks. Thanks a lot. So now let's move to Slovenia, and I'd like to give mic to Marko Lovec, who hasn't speak yet. So it's time for you, and you know the questions. But what's the perspective of the country from the members of new countries of the European Union? So how do you look at these issues? I asked from your perspective.
Yeah, okay, so thank you for your questions, and thanks all of you for having me here. I'll first make some general points, and then I'll move towards the more specific questions, or the frame for this second panel that you have presented. So first, more generally, I could say that speaking more about Central Europe than the rest of the region that is covered by this project, I could say that the elites in this part of Europe were very much pro-liberal, pro-Western, pro-EU oriented throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. And I would also say that the integration of this part of Europe, former socialist, communist countries into European Union, was a big success story for both sides of the Iron Curtain. But then, soon after the EU membership, things started to change in this region. It seemed as if expectations of the people were too high about what will happen after the enlargement. So the expectations that we would suddenly all live like Germans and so on. So it turned out that it would not be that easy. And then there was also this absence of a post-accession vision of what we should do next, of what we should do within the EU. And this showed that the whole center of the political authority within this new transition countries, newly emerged liberal democracy, probably relied too much on the idea of going back home towards Western Europe, and the idea of Brussels as this main political center of the political community. And this became even more obvious in the next decade that followed, in the decade of this big crisis of the EU, starting with the Eurozone crisis, which has hit dramatically several Central European countries, and this is often not mentioned sufficiently, I think. Hungary was affected by global economic crisis a lot, and this can explain in many ways the victory of Fidesz and also many nationalist, economically nationalist policies adopted by Fidesz government after the 2010. Slovenia also was affected significantly, also Czech Republic, Slovakia indirectly. Slovenia, for example, was before the crisis almost as developed as average EU member countries were, but with the crisis, with the high interest rates and things that happened because of the asymmetric dependencies, pressures of financial markets and so on, we basically went back in economic terms to where we were before the EU enlargement. So the impact was there. And that those crises had huge impact on the political elites, on the still pro-EU, pro-liberal, pro-Western political elites. So many centrist, pro-European parties would disappear overnight. Overnight, there would be a number of snap elections. Since 2008, none of the governments was able to survive by the end of the mandate, and there were landslides changes within the political space. So within this context, it was very hard for political elites to reproduce, to use the Marxist term. So in order to reproduce, they had to invent new methods, new tactics, and quite often they went back in the imaginary and also in terms of political strategies and tactics, they went back towards the times of the communist regime. So they started to use propaganda a lot. They started to concentrate power, put pressure on critical voices. They tried to control judiciary, media, suppress political opposition, and in many ways this was done to survive politically, to be able to reproduce, and this was done in a context in which centrist, pro-European voices were demotivated due to the fact that there was this huge crisis, which was also the crisis of the political center, the most important political thing that defined all other political issues, political questions. So the crisis of the EU and perhaps also of the Western liberal world in general. And then there was this big move, big shift in between the Eurozone and the migration crisis, because the Eurozone crisis was still in many ways an output crisis, to use Manuela's terms. It was an output legitimacy crisis, but then migration crisis was different, because migration crisis was already used by nationalist, right-wing, populist political forces in Central Europe in order to gain further grounds, to strengthen their position and to go directly against the EU. So it was used as a source of input legitimacy, as opposed to the Eurozone crisis, which was a source of output legitimacy for the Euro skeptics. But then after that, at 2016, 2017, also with Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump, this was sort of the climax, the peak for the Eurosceptics and in liberals in Slovenia, and I think also in many other Central European countries. So after that, support for the EU started to grow again. People saw some of the problems created by hybridization of liberal democracy and being mixed with more authoritarian styles of governance. And this change, this move again towards more progressive direction, can also explain some of the current ambiguities when it comes to the importance and role of terms Euroscepticism and illiberalism in this region, because most of the people in the region are still pro-EU oriented. So I think that if there was a referendum tomorrow, in none of the Central European countries, most of the people would vote to leave. And also when it comes to liberal values, I think that most of the people in this region are still pro-democracy, pro-human rights, pro-independent institutions. So Euroscepticism is in fact, it's soft and it's oriented towards some very specific issues which might not be important even in the region, such as migration, for example. And then when it comes to illiberalism, this has to do with attitudes towards gender, migration also to some extent. In some countries, religion is important in this context. In Poland, also in Slovenia, but to a more limited extent. And then there's this issue of anti-pluralism and pressures on independent institutions and things like that. But here, liberalism as a political idea is blurred with certain types of political tactics and strategies that are used by politicians who try to concentrate different sources of political power in order to be able to reproduce, to stay in the position of power. And now to just briefly touch upon the two specific questions that you had for this second panel. First, this was mentioned by Piotr about the importance of the regimes in different countries for one another. I would say that, especially for Slovenia, the most important factor is the concrete aid, concrete support that is given, especially by Orban regime, which is the most established illiberal regime in the region, towards certain allied parties in other countries, such as in Slovenia. So we have concrete financial support, which is sustaining the whole media apparatus that is supporting Slovenian Democratic Party in Slovenia. Then secondly, only second, I think, comes this external legitimacy, which is also important. So even though we see these national leaders often as a strong man, they are on the opposite. In reality, they are weak men. Often they are weak and they need this sort of external legitimacy to show their voters and the others that the things they are doing, the things they are defending are not certain, exotic North Korea style political ideas. So they really need to be seen and pictured with other important politicians from other countries. And I think that only on the third place comes the transfer of concrete ideas and tactics and images, because we can quite often see how different ideas are transferred from one national context to another, and then they come up in very strange ways that are not really taken and understood by people. So ideas taken from Hungary on gender equality and things like that transferred to Slovenia don't really work quite often in our context. And finally, about this new green division, I think that environmental issues currently are working much more for the EU and pro-European forces for many reasons. One being that young people who were not that active politically, are not that active traditionally, have taken those green ideas, pro-European ideas as their own, and they have been mobilized by those ideas. And then secondly, perhaps paradoxically, the European Green Deal is not, in fact, very green. It's more, financial, economic package. Many environmental NGOs are quite critical towards different regulations. They are calling them greenwash. So one of the reasons why European Green Deal is working is that it's, in fact, a financial stimulus package and not really, an environmental agenda. But there is this risk of a cleavage. Just to give you one funny example, alternative for Germany, 10 years ago, their main topic was Eurozone, Greeks have to go out, and then after that it was migration, and 2 or 3 years ago it was green ideas are destroying automotive, will destroy automotive industry in Germany. So this risk is there.
Thanks a lot for your answers and for bringing this structural perspective, which explains a lot. So I think we can elaborate on it a little bit more during the discussion. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dimitar and to North Macedonia, and what's your perspective from the country who is a candidate to European Union, and how do you look at the development of political forces inside Europe, and what is the answer of your political forces to what we are talking about here?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I think that we were the only ones who mentioned the green issue, at least at one point during the presentations, and it was exactly in favor of Euro enthusiasm, because I think that the European Union has done at least a good job in presenting itself. Macedonian citizens do not know more about the European Green Deal than actually that is called the Green Deal, and that's enough. And that is why there is this expectation that if we approximate to the European Union, or we eventually become members, that people who feel threatened in terms of environmental issues will get protection, will get more protection from the European Union. This is one point. The second one is that, in fact, a lot of the green issues in North Macedonia have been incorporated in some of the far-right movements now. Yeah, so you can see a lot of talk about this, and I think that there are some researchers who are talking about the future of, let's say, eco-fascism. Where was I? And then about the political power. Now, I think we said that there is that still this Eurosceptic, illiberal actors are still quite marginal in North Macedonia, and this is not because they don't have the potential, and they actually can have a lot of support, considering all the frustrations, especially in terms of identity issues and the treatment that the ethnic Macedonian community is getting from the neighbors and from the EU. But there is so much disagreement amongst all of these groups that it seems impossible for them to unite as a one force. Otherwise, they would be able to influence politics a lot more. Not as part of this project, but as part of other research, I have done a lot of field work exactly with these groups, and I can see that they are not capable of uniting and believing in one leader, etc., etc. And this might be also success of the secret services of the country, to enter them and to make them argue amongst each other. And I think Manuela was speaking about this prospect of European unification of these forces. Even if they found, I think, some middle ground or some minimal consensus in the beginning, I really doubt that it can be effective in the long run, because there will still, because of these national issues, because of prejudice, they will argue. And yeah, I don't believe in the longevity of such a big project. Sorry, was there another question that was raised? Oh yeah, whether there can be liberal forces. Was that the question? Was whether there can be liberal forces?
Yes,
for
who would adopt a Eurosceptic narrative in the future, sometime in the future?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Oh, first, before this, I forgot to mention that even we had this very, let's say, quite authoritarian rule between 2006 and 2017, VMRO-DPMNE party. The leader is now being kept in Budapest. We're good friends with Orban, and they were quite a textbook example of illiberal governance, and still they were very pro-European. And this is also success of, let's say, all of the political elites in the country from before. But considering now the treatment that the country is getting, it's not impossible to have liberal Eurosceptic parties in the future, simply because of this, about this elusive, let's say, project that the country would become a member. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And last but not least, Adam, and I'd like to add one more specific question about Polexit issue, because it's an issue in Poland. Now it's not raised, but it was quite hot a couple of weeks or months ago. So what you're thinking about this, of course, in the context of questions which I asked earlier. So.
Okay, thank you very much. So. First of all, of course, Marco has already mentioned that if you look at the opinion polls in our region, generally to a various degree, because for instance in Czechia, probably the level of some criticism towards the EU or soft Euroscepticism is much higher than, for instance, in Romania. But nevertheless, if we scratch the surface of this very general pro-European approach, of course, quite often we can realize that it's quite shallow, not very profound, not deeply entrenched. And if we divide, for example, during these opinion polls, we can, and also during these focus groups that we organized, conducted, that is my impression. I didn't take part in them, but of course I consulted Maria and so on. And I read reports. So my impression is that if we scratch the surface and we look at some concrete issues, the picture became much more complex. And of course, sometimes this attitude towards the EU is much more ambivalent and sometimes even full of contradictions, especially related to the issues even right now, what probably you had a chance to see that you have a lot of billboards, posters in the city with this light bulb, which in fact the message from this campaign, advertising campaign, is supported, political campaign is supported by state companies, and the message is that in fact, and we know that it's not true, this number, that 60% of the rise of energy prices, that the EU is responsible for that, and in fact the EU's energy policy. So that's the issue that, in fact, Maria also mentioned that during her presentation, that in fact that's the topic of our benefits, what we can get from the EU, that in fact it can be for us not very beneficial to remain a member state because of the EU's energy policy. And we know that, for instance, economists can explain that it's not true, it's a lie, that in fact it's less than 25% the responsibility of the EU for the rise of the energy prices, which is of course very much related to the inflation in Poland, which is above 9%, but nevertheless that's the message that people are getting, and which is financed by the public companies. So I think that Probably in the medium term, I don't expect that we can. I can't, me personally, imagine such a scenario that the rise of Euroscepticism will be so huge that, for instance, in the case of a possible referendum, the majority of Poles would vote for the Polexit. Yeah? But nevertheless, I can imagine that in the coming years, because of these various issues which can be related to sovereignty, cultural issues, economic issues, that of course various political forces can in fact misuse them, exploit them, and in fact this positive, sometimes polls are called that of course we are Euro enthusiastic, that's the highest support for the European Union in the EU, that it can decrease. I'm afraid of that, and then we can of course at some point we can cross the Rubicon and we can talk about a new reality. But right now I think that we can expect this kind of process, and in that case of course we can also expect political forces, like in case of Italy we have, you mentioned this liberal populists, we have this party which is right now on decline, but nevertheless it was quite influential, Cinque Stelle, 5 stars, which is of some kind of hybrid populism mix of from the center, mix of various ideas and so on. So I can imagine that in our region also similar parties can emerge. And then responding to your question to this, and which was raised also by Piotrek, and it's I think very important topic. Definitely, I have already mentioned that this green energy, all these issues, especially in Poland, they will be very important. You have already said that, because of the fact that we have very, let's put it that way, our energy balance is very dirty, carbon oriented and so on. So it's going to be a very important topic. But I think Piotr raised this issue, and we are trying also to do that through our research, is this cooperation between these political forces. And it's, of course, I don't believe in some kind of a very huge bloc alliance, which like, you know, umbrella that we attend of these far-right forces, uniting all of them, because it's a wide scope, a very huge diversity, variety of this hard, soft Euroscepticism. But we should acknowledge this fact that last year, especially what happened is that Fidesz left. They didn't want to be kicked out from the EPP. They left, and they started together with Law and Justice, PiS from Poland, and also with other political forces. They started this process to gather. And in fact, it's, of course, our motto, the European Union's motto is united in diversity. Probably they can end up with their own motto, divided in unity, because we can observe this enormous reshuffle of these soft and hard Eurosceptic forces and moderate and hard radical right. And definitely it's something, the scale of these consultations, meeting, they issued several declarations. It's something which is probably unprecedented in the most recent history of the European Union. It's, of course, it means that we can observe the composition, for instance, of both main political groups, Identity and Democracy, on the one hand, these guys which are more hard Eurosceptics, and more soft European conservatives and reformers. And for instance, some guys, the most extreme parties like Alternative für Deutschland, Wilders Party, Party for Freedom, they are moving to the right, and they are not they weren't invited to these gatherings. On the other hand, from the perspective of the Law and Justice, what is going on, that they contributed to, in fact, de facto the composition of their own political group, European Conservatives and Reformers, because important political parties are very reluctant. They don't want to be involved in this process. For instance, the Civic Democratic Party from Czechia, right now that's the main ruling party. Sweden Democrats, they are not interested because they would like to join center-right, and after the elections which are going to take place in autumn this year, they would like to be in government. Then we have also, for instance, parties from Slovakia, from Belgium, which are in the political group with PiS, but they didn't show up during these meetings. So we have this reshuffle, and of course there are very important challenges facing these efforts, especially attitude towards Russia. Sometimes it's, of course, surrealistic that, for instance, during this meeting in Madrid, in fact, Salvini and Meloni, they didn't show up. There was a... just a second. There was a false start in Warsaw, because that's a very tricky situation. Italy is a very complicated country, because we have two parties, one which supports the government, namely Lega, and one which is against the government, namely Fratelli d'Italia. Fratelli is on the rise and Lega is declining, and that's why it's very difficult it's a very difficult balancing act for political forces like PiS to have them both on board. But nevertheless, in Madrid, they sent both parties their representatives, low-ranking guys. I mean, it was some kind of gesture in the case of Lega and Fratelli. Okay, we can cooperate with you, but right now, we are a little bit offended of this situation in Warsaw. That's why we are sending only MPs. MAPs from the European Parliament, so low-ranking of low-profile politicians. But nevertheless, it was very symptomatic that there was a common declaration, a joint statement which was issued, and so on. And for instance, our Prime Minister was very proud of that statement, that Russia was mentioned in a very vague way. But nevertheless, it was quite funny because immediately Le Pen denied that she endorsed this declaration, and in fact what is even more surrealistic, that you can find this declaration on the party's webpage, but without exactly these two sentences related to Russia. So it's really some kind of absurd. So of course there are serious challenges facing these efforts to unite these forces, definitely. But nevertheless, I can imagine that because of various factors that they would like to cooperate despite difference against so-called mainstream, that certain parties, that we can expect some kind of reshuffle and cooperation between them on a wider scale than before. And in that case, definitely it's very important that I think that a lot will depend on the performance of PiS and Fidesz, because they are the only political parties that, in fact, they rule the EU member states, in difference to other forces, and they to a large degree, they should serve as some kind of driving forces, engines of this cooperation. That's why their role will depend a lot. At the same time, they sometimes, what is in fact unprecedented, that these politicians, especially Orban, they started to serve as an important source of inspiration in ideological sphere for Western political forces.
Thanks a lot. So we are after the second debate. Thanks for all your interventions, and now we are opening discussion. And perhaps, Laurnas, you haven't had an opportunity to express yourself, so perhaps because we have only 15 minutes for this discussion.
Yes, I'll have a very quick question, because I think when you were doing this research, most of you guys, it was at the time when the European Union was negotiating the recovery plan, and it's sort of a fundamental change when we look at the European Union, especially the output side of things. It's the first time that we have pooled our debt together, in a sense that we've made our borrowing we shared the burden. And in the case of Italy, I mean, there was the hope that this would really change the overall tendencies and some of the northern Eurosceptical narratives. That's something that look how we can deal with it. I mean, maybe it doesn't really, this question doesn't really go towards North Macedonia, which is a slightly different position, but I think for the European countries, especially Poland, Slovenia and Italy, this was, how do you feel, can this in any way have an impact, or it's too abstract and people don't really know what's a common debt and so on? And then, but even connecting to this, I think the money, when you look in absolute terms, the money going towards Western Balkans and say Eastern Partnership, that's also been rising. It's not been, there's not been some sort of a serious decline. When it comes to the green issues, I think, yes, I think Marko said the very right point. I think in Poland, when we talk that there is a risk with the green issues being used against the European Union, but on the other hand, when you look at the way Polish people have reacted to all the different green initiatives when it comes to the photovoltaics or the wind power, whenever the government did not ban these things and the government supported them, the Polish people were themselves transferring the energy, you know, changing the energy as much as they could. You know, the photovoltaic panels in the last 2 years, the wind power more or less 8 years or whenever that was ago. So I think there is, inside the Polish people are not that, I think they're fairly mercantilistic, and they do understand that it's green is nothing bad, and it's something very sort of mainstream capitalist, neoliberal capitalist, and as long as it functions, I think it's only depends on how much the government is exploiting it. It's not really a serious threat from deep inside.
Thanks. Is anybody wanting to answer this question? Or adds other issues to our discussion? So feel free. Who is ready to? Okay.
Go with just a short answer. Well, you were right. There were no mention about this common debt during the focus groups. People are not that much interested in the details of what is going on really in the negotiations within the European Union. They are just interested of what they can see and what impact some policies can have on them. But they are getting their information from news, from headlines, and not going into big details. So the only thing that was mentioned, it was that the Polish plan is not accepted by the European Union, and it should be accepted because we should get the money, because the European Union promised us the money, so why we are not getting them, and that the European Union is interfering too much in the judicial system, and it's not the case. It shouldn't be the case. So this was the only things that were mentioned really in the focus groups in Poland.
Thanks. Anybody else? Oh, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Yes, I can try, but actually I should reflect with more time, because you raised two very important points that we didn't realize now, and we didn't talk a lot about that. The correspondence of our time frame of data analysis with some critical juncture also for the European process. So this can be. So thank you for that. Now, as for Italy, I have to say that, in answer to that, I have to say that usually Italy has this tradition of domestication of European issue. So, for instance, I remember that when there was the debate about the European Constitution in the first years of the 2000s, the unique debate, so better, the only discussions at the citizens level and therefore political parties level about this constitution, European Constitution issue, was about the preamble of the Constitution, if we was integrating some reference to Catholic religion or not. In my view, this domestication of European issues in Italy is also to be related somehow at the role of the media, because the way our media transmit usually European issues is a way which follow a lot some logics like news values. So some aspects which are related to how much a newspaper or an article can be sold, not so much on how much informative it is. So what I echo, my answer is yes, you are right. Also in Italy, in our as answers to our questions, this idea of the common debt or good occasion for also for Italy was not mentioned. almost never. So I don't know why. We should reflect about that. I think that it was not neither in the public debate. So for instance, if I have to say what was and what is still in the public debate about Europe, paradoxically, is the point connected to the pandemic concerning the libertarianism. So economic libertarianism, not the freedom to, or the sanitarian libertarianism, and therefore many European recommendations and rules, let's say, are perceived as a dictatorship, not from Europe. So also the COVID, let me say, a topic, in my view, is giving room for eventually extra Eurosceptic frames, based on this libertarianism frame, which that the radical right forces are using a lot. So Meloni, Salvini. The debt was not mentioned. So thank you.
Thank you, Marco. You'd like to?
Yeah, just a couple of points. So why was pandemic different from the previous two crises, the Eurozone and the migration crisis? Why was it a pro-EU moment? For once, because populists and nationalists were already in position of power. So before we had liberal Democrats mostly, but now we already had populists. And people sort of somehow didn't trust the populists to solve the health and economic issues, that they did not see them as credible providers of solutions. And in fact, we can see that many countries with populist leaders underperformed. So within this region, Central Europe, we had higher death toll and we have lower vaccination rates, which means that the leaders in those countries did not perform. In spite of the fact that they control media and different institutions, they were not able to convince people to get vaccinated. So we can see this issue of mistrust of people towards certain types of institutions. And then ECFR, it's too bad that Piotr is no longer here, they made a big poll across Europe, and this poll showed that during the pandemic, there was not that much of Euroscepticism. So this was before this big financial deal was agreed and so on, but there was more of people were asking for the EU. People were asking questions such as, where is the EU? We need the EU to solve this one for us. Because of economic dependencies, because of the deficits and debts, we need a different economic approach from the EU side, especially for the Eurozone members. And this time EU did reply. The members agreed on this big increase of finance, and they did it quite quickly. And then there was this also the idea of environmental sustainability, and then rule of law issue was thrown in. So I think that this is what strengthened pro-EU forces, along with the fact that populists underperformed. But this budget issue, it's tricky, because the current EU budget was used as a guarantee to get new loans, but these loans will have to be returned. And the idea of the Commission is that we will have new financial sources, new taxes, tax on plastics, tax on carbon, and so on. But if those taxes are not agreed in the forthcoming years, then current budget will be used to repay for this loan, which means that in future we will not have the money for cohesion and agriculture if in the next years we don't agree on new financial sources. So this money that we are currently spending, it's very tricky money. And there's a joke because it's called next generation, because it's supposed to bring better future to the children. But in fact, the reason why it is called next generation is that it will be the next generation that will pay for the loan. So yeah, it's tricky.
So it is why our government is happy that don't have this money. Simply. Okay, so we have another 6 minutes. Somebody else would like to add? Okay. Adam, yeah?
I mean, in our Polish case, definitely Laurenas raised this issue of money from the EU, and probably right now we are approaching this watershed, the moment of truth, because of the ruling of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which declared that, stated that this mechanism of conditionality related to the EU funds and to the rule of law, in fact, is legal and is not is in line with with acquis communautaire. And in that case, definitely, what is very important in the case of Poland and Hungary, so we definitely will need to wait a little bit for the implementation, the scale, how it's going to be interpreted by the European Commission and so on, because it can have a very huge impact on the developments in both countries. If everything, of course, in my opinion, depends on the interpretation. It can be wider, narrower, and for instance, for some people, can be, if it's going to be narrower, the interpretation of the European Commission. In that case, we can expect some kind of disappointment of people supporting the opposition and critical towards government. In case of a wider interpretation, it's going to be one of the most important challenges to both parties, Fidesz and the Law and Justice, namely in recent years. Yeah, it's going to be really something, maybe a game changer in fact, that they will have to change a little bit, at least their policies. And of course, in that case, what is worrying me, that I mentioned this reshuffle of the these political forces, Identity and Democracy, and European Conservatives and Reformers. In fact, these developments and trajectories that we can observe, what is going on with certain parties, is unfortunately also radicalization. That what happened to Fidesz is definitely moved to the right, and what is going on of course, we have much more, in the case of Poland, the ruling elite is much more diverse internally in comparison to Fidesz, where there is this definitely one chief and so on, and hierarchy. But nevertheless, we can also observe that this the composition of the European Conservatives and Reformers means also that peace is also moving to the right. So again, that's an open-ended question. The final outcome of these processes, of this reshuffle, rearrangement of the political scene on the right.
Thanks a lot. We are close to the end of our conference, so perhaps Dimitar, as a coordinator of this project, would you like to wrap up it and say some words in the end of it?
Yes, thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting us here. So just to maybe reiterate from the beginning that we are now officially finished with the first part of the project, where we only presented the research, and then in the second part, we are going to concentrate more on developing these counter-narratives and developing this network against Euroscepticism. And our next event will be on the 10th of March. It will also be hybrid, so I would like to invite the audience that is listening to us now to join us for the next event as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And Laurenas, it's for you to close this conference as a real host of it.
Yes, I like the old joke, you know, what's the difference between Hitler and Stalin, you know? Hitler likes to be applauded to, and Stalin applauds with the people. So I would say that we all applaud to ourselves, and let's have a good evening. Thank you very much for being with us, and good evening to everyone.